Hello and welcome back to our history of the royal family. I have my Princess Diana cup, as you can see, England's rose. I got this at Kensington Palace. But we have no time for chit chat. This video is sponsored by Ernest Tea, and I am actually drinking a wonderful Lapsang Souchong tea called the Harperwood's Yule Log, but we got to jump right into our material. So we left off part 1 with the end of the Plantagenets, or the split of the Plantagenets into the House of Lancaster and the House of York. So the White Rose versus the Red Rose. And this actually is going to be the conflict known as the War of the Roses. So we're going to jump right in because there is quite a lot of tea to cover. Lots of juicy gossip in this story. And for those of you who are familiar with Game of Thrones, the Game of Thrones saga by George R.R. Martin is actually loosely based on the story of the War of the Roses, and just the ups and downs and all of the murder and intrigue that happened during the War of the Roses. So we start off with the Plantagenet split into Lancaster and the House of York, and the battle between the two, while all of England was at war with France, only to have two families reunited as the House of Tudor in the very end. And the House of Tudor is the most ubiquitous families in all of English history. So when you think of the English royals, you think of who? King Henry VIII. You think of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. You think of Bloody Mary. We're going to get into them, and we're going to leave off with the Tudor family. So you recall in last episode, we left off with King Edward III. He died, and his throne was then passed to his grandson. The 10-year-old child, the boy king, Edward III, married Blanche of Lancaster, a powerful duchess, and a duchess who was the daughter of the Earl of Lancaster. So the House of Lancaster was a short reign of 3 kings, all named Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. Now, the Lancaster period was marked with continual warfare. The barons were in revolt. They either supported Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, or, there were just different factions who warred against each other. So the 100 Years' War never really stopped. It was England against France, as mentioned last time. Henry V renews this conflict, gaining control of English claims in France and marrying Catherine of France. So at this time, Joan of Arc led a campaign to drive the English out of France in 1429, and then she was captured by the English in 1431 and burned at the stake. So Henry V's son's reign was plagued by instability and constant plots of scheming advisors like the Earl of Shaftesbury and, the Earl of Somerset, and of course the Duke of York. And then shrewd political maneuvering by King Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou. So Margaret of Anjou was very strategic and was sort of the brains behind the operation, because King Henry VI, he had lots of bouts with mental instability. And so I think this is something that you'll later see when we talk about the Hanovers with King George III, going in and out of this ability to maintain just control of his mental facilities. And so many saw his leadership as weak and ineffective. He relied a lot on advisors like his cousin Richard, Duke of York, and he also relied on his wife and her advisors. So the Yorks had even more of a stronger claim than, anybody else, really, to the Plantagenet line. So essentially, King Edward IV was the son of, Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, and he was a direct descendant of Richard III. Under this rule, the Lancasters, particularly King Henry VI and his wife, who I mentioned, was very beautiful and very power hungry. She gave birth to a son, and she sort of bumped Richard out of the line of succession. And so therefore, it's, she has even more power. And so Richard has this popular support, and in comes, of course, the Earl of Warwick. No, not that Warwick, but the Earl of Warwick is really a very wealthy man, and he's aligning himself with Richard. And, you know, Richard at that point had been made Lord Protector of England twice under King Henry VI. And so Richard then took up arms against the Lancasters in the first battle in the War of the Roses, the Battle of St. Albans. In 1460, Richard was defeated in the battle against the Lancastrians, and then, you know, his head was placed on a spike. So he was finally defeated. His son, King Edward VI, was then proclaimed to be, you know, King of England. And at the time, he actually had the support of the Earl of Warwick. But there's more intrigue here. King Henry VI is still King of England, or at least is still coming in and out of this mental instability and, you know, either being, you know, ruled by Margaret or by advisors. And he is, you know, placed on the throne again. So the wealthy Earl of Warwick comes in and is allies with the Duke of York, and then therefore pays allegiance to his son until his son, King Edward IV, he marries a widowed commoner. You know, when the Earl of Warwick had picked out, he handpicked this French princess to kind of make things right with France for Edward IV. But instead he like secretly marries this other woman who's a commoner, and he's just like, oh no, you just made me mad. So I'm about to go over here and align myself with Margaret, who has been my mortal enemy for years, and we are going to, you know, bring the Plantagenets back to power. In that time, King Henry VI was placed back on the throne, and then in 1471, Warwick was defeated, and Margaret of Anjou was exiled, and then her son was killed. Her son and heir was killed, and finally, King Henry VI was actually murdered. We have Edward IV finally being able to reign as King of England, and his heirs, you know, were going to be the ones who went on to rule England. Then he dies in 1480. So when he died, his brother, Richard III, yes, the Richard III, the Shakespearean villain, who actually, according to historians, was really handsome and didn't have a hunchback or any of these other evil traits that he was supposedly believed to have had. You know, he takes over from his brother, and he becomes King Richard III only after taking custody. Like, okay, so here's the real thing. So his nephew, Edward, was supposed to become king, and he was 12 years old at the time. And so Richard III, he takes over kind of to act as regent on behalf of his nephew. So he has his nephew, Edward, and his younger brother, Richard. I know there's so many Richards and so many Edwards and Henry. It's like in medieval England, there was you only had 3 options for names, which Edward, Richard, or Henry. So, but I digress. Essentially, you know, Richard he wants to protect his nephews. He puts his nephew Edward in the Tower of London with his little brother Richard. So these 2 princes are put in the Tower of London for their protection. And then they come up missing. And then that's when Richard becomes King Richard III, because he had them murdered. So he had these little children murdered, and then he becomes king, and he thinks that, you know, yeah, I just murdered these kids, so I'm gonna become king, and it's gonna, no karma, no anything bad's gonna happen to me. And this is the end of the War of the Roses forever. I am the Yorkist who is going to rule, and no more Lancasters are going to try to unseat any of us York, but that's not the case. So you have a guy named Henry Tudor who actually has claim to the Lancastrian line, and he's a descendant of King Edward III. And so therefore, he is saying that, okay, well, I'm gonna put together an army, and we're gonna stage an uprising, and we're going to kill Richard III, and we're going to take over England. And he had been exiled to France and been living there for some time, and then, you know, he put together this army, and he, you know, even though King Richard III's army was huge and it was very powerful, his army was still defeated by Henry Tudor. So Henry Tudor becomes King of England, and, you know, as this final act of peace and, you know, reconciliation, so to speak, he marries the sister of, you know, the 2 little boys who were, you know, murdered in the Tower of London. He marries the child of King Edward IV. So she is the Yorkist, and he is a Lancaster, and together the Tudor dynasty brings an end to not only the War of the Roses, but the end between the squabbles, you know, between the Lancaster, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And so thereby uniting the Plantagenets, because honestly this has really been one big giant Plantagenet versus Plantagenets, and finally it just wraps up, and you know, then we have the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. So, and that's where we pick up with the Tudors. Thanks for watching. Remember to share, subscribe, and look forward to sharing more history with. All right, Ernestine Lyons. Ta-ta. Cheerio.